Be one of the watershed days in financial markets history.
$700 billion in bad loans.
Our country could experience a long and painful recession.
Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy.
Since the 2008 financial crisis, the GDP gap between the United States and the European Union has been growing. In 2008, the EU and the US had similar GDPs, but now the US economy is $8.6 trillion larger than that of the EU. In per capita terms, the US is now more than twice that of the EU. As many EU populations are shrinking with lower fertility rates than in the US, this disparity in economic influence is likely to continue growing.
The Eurozone economy fell into recession in the first 3 months of 2023, while revised data showed that growth contracted by 0.1%.
Europe has experienced stagnant economic growth for more than a decade now, while the rest of the world has been thriving. Just 15 years ago, Europe's economy was $1.5 trillion larger. However, since then, the EU has lost ground, with the US claiming the #1 spot in the early 90s. This trend is continuing, and the US economy appears to be in solid shape currently, with record low unemployment and the fight against inflation mostly appearing to be on track. Meanwhile, the mood in Europe is predominantly grim, with the continent's economic powerhouse, Germany, seemingly in recession and inflation remaining high. Just a part of the history of the EU, and, in fact, history has shown that it can be an engine of progress for the continent. However, what's happening here may not be a crisis, but rather a sinking into chronic stagnation. Some viewers will argue that these comparisons are of little value and misleading, because GDP numbers are based on current exchange rates, which fluctuate significantly. Additionally, America and Europe are different, and the lower levels of prosperity in Europe result from conscious decisions to promote a better work-life balance and have social security systems that care for all. Yes, European lifestyles are less stressful and more relaxing. European healthcare systems, with their near-universal coverage, are also superior. Such observations are valid, but only up to a point. These situations may get worse if Europe fails to beat stagnant economic growth. So, what explains the persistent divergence between two of the world's richest regions, in which the US has grown at roughly double the pace of Europe over the past decades?
These are 6 of the many languages of Western Europe. Together with religion, legal systems, and technical knowledge, they have significantly shaped the way the world is today. To them, the concept signified neither land nor nation. Some scholars say that Western Europe consists of as many as 20 independent nations, each, in its view, unique and different.
Europe is a diverse economic region, encompassing advanced economies at the forefront of competitiveness, innovation, and productivity, as well as economies that are still in the process of catching up. Therefore, the European Union does not represent a single economy with uniform rates of economic performance across its membership. Over the past 20 years, a general trend has emerged. Economic growth has been rapid in Central and Eastern European countries that joined the EU during this period, while growth rates have been sluggish, especially in continental economies. The economic growth in the euro area, a region comparable to the US, has been notably disappointing. The region has been trailing behind the US since the 1980s, resulting in a decline in the overall economic performance rates of the EU. Various structural explanations account for these lagging growth rates. If we take GDP and the standard of living off the table, there's a more fundamental issue at work here. Let's start with productivity. Productivity is the keystone of prosperity, growth, and a flourishing society. Over time, productivity has grown faster in the US than in Europe. Focusing on the components of productivity growth reveals some interesting patterns in economic behavior. Europe's productivity growth, especially in the last 20 years, has been substantially driven by capital deepening, meaning that the amount of capital per worker has increased. However, total factor productivity (TFP) growth in the EU, which can be seen as a benchmark for the rate of technology and innovation growth in the economy, was stronger in the 1990s. Since then, it has declined. The slowdown in productivity growth in Europe does not seem to be driven by large structural shifts in the economy, such as the secular trend of the services sector taking up a larger share of total output in Europe. In fact, such shifts appear to have had a positive effect on the employment composition, leading to higher levels of productivity. The major factor behind the decline occurs within sectors rather than across them. Notably, in the manufacturing sector, the productivity slowdown has occurred across all firm sizes and for all segments in the productivity distribution. Growth in productivity is critical for sustained economic growth. It is partly driven by a higher pace of research, technology, innovation, and investment. More generally, the contribution to economic growth that comes from individuals, firms, and markets adopting new technologies and business. Today, the Eurozone features lower levels of public investment as a percentage of GDP than any other advanced economy or economic bloc. In terms of their rate of overall investment, the UK comes last within Europe's big economies. This low level of investment is caused by the unprecedented level of austerity European governments inflicted upon their economies following the 2008 global financial crisis.
I can confirm that the government has today decided that Ireland apply for financial assistance to the European Union.
Austerity is not only detrimental to vulnerable people in need of state support during tough times, but it also stifles investment. In any economy, collective expenditure equals collective income. By substantially reducing public expenditure at a time when private expenditure was falling, European governments hastened the rate at which total income diminished. Europeans are not spending much. EU private consumption has been declining since 2008 and is now at an all-time low, whereas US private consumption is increasing and is at an all-time high. When private consumption increases, it signals that households and individuals have more disposable income and are feeling confident about their financial situation. This, in turn, leads to increased demand for goods and services, which can drive economic growth. Weak spending and poor demographic prospects are making Europe less attractive for businesses ranging from consumer goods giant Procter & Gamble to luxury empire LVMH, which are making an ever larger share of their sales in North America. The US consumer is more resilient than in Europe. Is it any wonder that Europe's businesses refused to invest in the capacity to produce goods that consumers would not have the money to buy? That's how post-2008 austerity slayed continent-wide investment and put Europe on a path of secular decline. Across Europe, investment in manufacturing green tech is woeful. Batteries, artificial intelligence, and all the digital technologies that are driving global growth have left Europe in their wake. Back in 1990, Europe was manufacturing 44% of the world's semiconductors. Now it only makes 9%. The US produces 12%, while China produces more than both at 15%. The reality is that the US outperforms Europe in all classes of transversal or cutting-edge technology, technologies which break a new path for the economy. It generates more patents than Europe in computing and AI, technologies known to be strong for the US, because the US has been spending much on R&D compared to the EU. Studies also show a significant gap in input factors like corporate level spending on R&D, as well as output factors like corporate profitability. According to new research by the McKinsey Global Institute, between 2014 and 2019, European firms grew on average 40% slower than their US peers and spent 40% less on R&D. However, in materials technology and clean tech, classes of technology where Europe traditionally has had strong competitiveness and outperformed the US, the EU is still ahead of China in most technology categories. But China and other Asian developing countries are digitizing and adopting new technology and innovation so rapidly that it potentially leaves Europe behind in the coming decades. Then there is one element that's completely dominated by the US: its corporate power. Tech giants such as Apple, Google, Alphabet Inc., and Amazon showcase this phenomenon. These companies not only dominate their respective markets, but also have a global impact, shaping technological innovation and influencing consumer behavior worldwide. Their economic clout allows them to invest heavily in research and development, contributing to advancements in areas like artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and e-commerce. If we look at any ranking of the global corporate hierarchy, whether it's the top 50, top 500, top 100, or top 20, American firms dominate. China is number 2, and the Europeans, who 20 or 30 years ago would have been amply and strongly represented by the big names of 20th century industry such as Fiat's, Mercedes-Benz's, BMW's, Siemens's. All of them have dropped down the hierarchy. Now, Europe is left with a position where it basically has very few significant global players, with none in the platform area and only 2 in tech: ASML, the Dutch lithography firm, and SAP, the German software house. Europe has been facing its current problems for a long time. The population is getting older, and people prioritize free time and job security more than higher earnings, leading to slow economic and productivity growth. On top of that, the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's prolonged war in Ukraine have made things even more challenging. In this situation, the US has had some natural advantages, such as being the largest fossil fuel producer in the world, while Europe is a consumer. The increase in energy prices, much higher than in the US in the aftermath of Russia's invasion, is hurting the economy and its people. The EU is the world's second largest economy. Even more importantly, it is the world's largest trader of goods and services. In the past, the continent's strong export industry has helped in a difficult situation. Since exports can be a source of vulnerability as well as strength, a more focused measure of trade power is dependence on foreign markets. The more trade-dependent a country is, the less powerful it is. Europe's heavy reliance on exports, which account for about 50% of Eurozone GDP versus 10% for the US, is becoming a weakness. The weakening global demand and a sluggish recovery in China, a critical market for Europe, is undermining that growth pillar. High energy costs and rampant inflation at a level not seen since the 1970s are dulling manufacturers' price advantage in international markets. Now, this isn't to deny that Europe's growth performance has been disappointing in the last 15 years. After the end, in the course of the Eurozone crisis from 2009 to 10 onwards, they committed what can only be described as policy crimes, and from 2012 onwards, austerity pushed the years of underinvestment in the economy. Regardless of the reason, this crisis will handicap Europe on many dimensions, including growth, inclusion, sustainability, and its strategic autonomy and voice in the world. Europe can continue to build on its strengths. Its socio-economic model has served well thus far. When Europe works, it works well. On sustainability, Europe has 2.4 times lower CO2 emissions per capita than the United States, and 1.8 times lower CO2 emissions per unit of GDP. On inclusion, Europe leads on most dimensions, including equality, social progress, and life satisfaction. Income inequality, as measured by the Gini index, is only 29.6, which has been declining since 2014, while it is 41 in the United States. On social mobility, all top 10 countries in the Social Mobility Index published by the World Economic Forum are European. Europe overall has the highest life expectancy in the world, averaging 80.3 years, compared to 79 in the United States and 77 in China. European countries have been leaders on sustainability and inclusion. They are now concerned with the security of supply chains, energy, food, and defense. How much should the region also worry about its corporate and technology gap, which is jeopardizing future growth and strategic autonomy, and when? Can the momentum of common action triggered by the war in Ukraine now also provide the impetus to make the trade-offs needed for technology and competitiveness that have long felt difficult? Policymakers probably need to do more to figure out how to improve how businesses and innovation work in Europe. This means looking closely at each type of technology and industry and finding ways to make Europe's way of doing things stronger and more able to last for a long time. It's like fixing the weak spots and making sure Europe stays competitive in the business and technology world.